Hello, Happy New Year, Happy Chinese New Year. I hope you're having a brilliant start to the year. I thought I would surprise you in the new year with a review of the Sony MDR-Z7M2, and we'll just let that autofocus kick in. So this is the Z7M2 or Mark II, the second generation version of the Sony Z7 that I reviewed on this channel way back. So just like with my review of the Z7, this is going to be a mixed review, though I feel more positive about this headphone than I did about the Z7. Basically, with this headphone, it's better than I expected, but not as good as I would hope, but I still like it more than the Sony MDR-Z1R, and I don't quite like it as much as my beloved XBA Z5. So we'll get into that in this video. So, in case you missed the memo, I now work at Minidisc, a headphone store in Australia, but we don't actually sell the Z7M2. I got the Z7M2 from Addicted to Audio during their Australia Day sales. So in Australia, the Z7M2 retails for $12.99 Australian dollars, but during the Australia Day sales, it went down to $7.99 Australian dollars, which is basically a 40% discount. And as I understand it, in Japan, this headphone has gone even lower in price from the regular retail price, as low as 48,000 yen, though I think the current street price is around 70,000 yen. So at the $12.99 MSRP, that puts the Sony Z7 Mark II in this new kind of battleground that's developing in the headphone market, where you have full-sized headphones that are not so much portable as they are transportable, but they can still be driven out of a portable device. So in that category, you have things like the Beyerdynamic T5P and the Focal Elysia. And those are full-size headphones, so you're still not going to really wear them on the street, but you could very well wear them at work for long periods of time, sitting down. You could even wear them on international flights, which is what I'm sort of planning to do with the Z7 Mark II. And because they are full-sized headphones, they are more comfortable, basically, than a compact around-ear headphone. But at the same time, they're still able to be driven out of a device like, say, the Sony ZX300 with the included 4.4mm balance cable, perfectly capable of driving this to very listenable volumes. So that's different and distinct from, say, things like the Beyerdynamic DT1770, which has a 250 ohm impedance, not really designed for portable devices, unless you have something like, say, the Aston Khan, the Audeze LCD2 closed back, which again, you could kind of drive out of a portable device, but it's extremely heavy. I guess it still counts in this category. And if you had a shorter cable made up for it, the Fostex TH610 is another headphone in this sort of transportable portable headphone category. But I picked the Z7 Mark II over all the above mentioned headphones, even though I actually think I enjoy the TH610 and the T5P more in sound. I picked the Z7 Mark II because it's really comfortable. So let's have a closer look at the headphone. So taking a closer look at the design, first of all, I want to say that the build quality of this headphone is top notch. It's really not far off from the flagship Z1R. The key differences from the Z1R in terms of build quality is that it doesn't have that lovely, complicated, curved chromium plated ear cup. It just has this aluminium/magnesium alloy cup. And the actual ear pads are made of a slightly different material, though they are still very plush and pliable, as you can see. And the ear pads still have that curved shape, where they slightly curve out at the bottom to better conform with your lower jaw. And that's the thing that I think makes this headphone super, super comfortable for me. The combination of the super plush pads and the way that it completely seals around my lower jaw, unlike any other headphone I've really tried, makes this headphone super, super comfortable. It's also lighter than the Z1R. I think about 50 or 60 grams lighter, meaning that it is actually a bit more comfortable than the Z1R. So that was the key sort of buying decision for me, was the comfort of this headphone over things like the TH610 and the T5P. I mean, the TH610 and the T5P are still comfortable headphones, but this is really, if you remember how much I gushed over the comfort of the Sony MDR-MA900, this is sort of the closed back headphone equivalent of that. Not quite like a dream or a cloud on the head, but it's pretty close. And I really always think that Sony knows how to make a comfortable headphone. There's something about the industrial design of this headphone which is also very attractive to me, because it has that classic kind of Sony monolithic brutalism, but it has all these curves and those kinds of things that give it a sort of, I don't know, sort of a sensual feel if we're going to get a bit intimate with this headphone. Now, along with these sensual curves, you get this beautiful locking connector for the cables. It is actually a standard 3.5mm termination on the end of these cables, but because of that locking connector, you'll find that you could probably make aftermarket cables, but they won't lock in. What I've got here is the standard 1.2 meter balanced cable attached to this headphone, and that's going into my ZX300 here. But it also comes with the 3 meter standard 3.5mm stereo cable with a adapter included, which is nice. Of course, the one thing that this headphone does not come with, and it's a bit of a disappointment, is that it comes without any sort of carrying case or carrying pouch even, which is really disappointing, because you can expect that, given that they give you the 1.2 meter balanced cable, that's sort of Sony's way of saying, hey, this is a portable headphone. You could use it with a portable device like maybe our own Sony ZX300 players. However, without the carrying case, it really makes it difficult to sort of bring this headphone outside of the house. So it's a little bit of a puzzling decision. I realized that there were cost constraints, but this is a kilobuck headphone. So honestly, Sony, give us a case. I'm trying to still source a case for this headphone. I know that the AutoZ LCD2 cases can fit the Z7, but honestly, they seem a little bit of an overkill choice. Anyway, before we talk about the sound of this headphone, one more thing I want to talk about are the key differences from the original Z7 design. One of them is that this headphone is very, very ported. If you can see, there are 6 ports on each ear cup. 1, 2, 3 at the top, and 1, 2, 3 at the bottom. So Sony has apparently decided to add all these ports to sort of improve the control of the bass response, or at least changing the damping of the headphone. So this is a lot more ports than the original Z7, and more ports than the Z1R, which just has the port at the top. Now, surprisingly, given the number of ports, you'd think that this is basically a semi-open headphone that doesn't isolate. It isolates better than you expect, given the number of ports, but it still doesn't isolate as well as something that's more or less completely sealed, like the Beyerdynamic T5P. The isolation is on par with something like, say, the Focal Elysia, maybe slightly better than the Focal Elysia in terms of isolation. I would say that this headphone doesn't cut it on the bus, but in any sort of an office environment, I think that you'd get more than enough isolation. The other big difference from the Z7, and this is inherited from the Z1R, is, I don't know if you can see it, but that Fibonacci sequence waveguide, which is sort of tantalizing to look at. Sony claims that this waveguide helps attenuate the high frequencies, it helps smooth them out, and that's something else that you can sort of hear from the Z7 and particularly the Z1R in terms of the high frequencies. So let's talk about how this headphone sounds. So I think that in the past, Sony has been sort of hit and miss, or at least inconsistent with where they were going with their audio products. So you had this kind of transition from the kind of typical Japanese vocal forward tuning, like with the Sony SA3000, the SA5000 full-size headphones, and things like the EX700 and the EX1000 in-ears. And then they started kind of experimenting basically with bass. So you had the XBA series of balanced in-ears, and in the full-size headphone category, Sony was kind of going nowhere, I guess, with the Z1000, and that was kind of it. But I would say that in recent years, with their current lineup, Sony has become much more consistent with their house sound, and I would say they've become much more consistently weird. Because the new Sony house sound is completely different from everyone else on the market. It's almost as if, to quote Charlie XCX, Sony got out of bed one morning and just said, I don't want to follow that no more. They decided that they want to do something completely different. They don't want to go Sennheiser neutral. They don't want to go Audio-Technica vocal forward. Instead, they want a Sony house sound. And the Sony house sound now is, by and large, really thick bass and mid-bass emphasis, like a really kind of thick, thumpy sound in that low-end region, and then a bit of a scoop in the vocals, and then a big high-frequency treble spike, not where the vocals, the upper vocals are, but generally where the shimmer region is, sort of to give everything that sort of shimmery detail without necessarily getting piercing in the instrument range where, say, brass instruments or female vocals lies. So this is actually really different, I would say, than anything else that any other manufacturer is making. And I would not necessarily say that that's a good or a bad thing. It's good to have diversity in the market, but definitely Sony's house sound has been sort of unnatural sounding. Now, obviously, not all of Sony's current headphones sound exactly the same, but it's definitely more than a fluke. It's definitely more than just one headphone having this kind of unusual tuning. When you have something like the XBA-Z5 and the new MDR-Z7M2 or Mark II, or the Z1R and the 1000XM3, the noise cancelling wireless headphone, when they all share that kind of profile of having that basic sort of thick bass region coupled with that high frequency spike, you'd say that it is a consistent sort of direction or philosophy from the company. And I hesitate to even say that it's a sort of V-shaped signature where the bass and the treble is accentuated, because when I say V-shaped, it might make you think that they sound like, say, Beyerdynamics, but they just don't. All the new Sony headphones sound like Sony headphones, right? They have this kind of cavernous bass response and this very kind of localized peak, and they just sound, for lack of a better word, they sound kind of lumpy. You can listen to them and you can tell what's going on with the frequency response. They definitely aren't neutral. Now, am I going to come out and say the Z7 Mark II is the best version of this new Sony house sound? No, I'm not. But I will say that the Z7 Mark II improves on the kind of Sony house sound from, say, the Z1R in a lot of ways. So let's talk about how this headphone compares with the Z1R. So the Z1R is definitely, it sticks to what I just described in terms of that house sound from Sony. It has that really big cavernous mid-bass and bass region, and then a scooped kind of vocal section, so there's not much density to male or female vocals. There's not a kind of richness, or some would call it the presence region is sort of lacking. And then they have this high frequency peak, which to me is sort of the least desirable aspect of the Z1R's sound, because I think the Z1R sounds okay, but what really kind of ruins it for me, and it's a similar sort of opinion to what Tile came up with in his review of the Z1R way back, but it has this treble that is just sort of grainy. It's not immediately fatiguing, but after a few minutes when you listen to it, you kind of realize that it has this grain to the sound that I don't really like. And personally, whenever I listen to the Z1R, I kind of always really wish that it sounded more like the XBA Z5, which still, don't get me wrong, it still has that huge treble peak, but it doesn't have it to the same sort of, maybe it's a different emphasis for whatever issue my ears have with it, but it does a better job to me in terms of not sounding as so grainy and rough. So the Z7 Mark II in comparison sounds different in two big ways. Number one, the mid bass on the Z7 Mark II is a little reined in compared to the Z1R. So it's sort of not as thick in that mid bass region. That means that you still get a very kind of a localized thumpy bass thud, and it's definitely not flat in the bass region as, say, something like the Auto-Z LCD2. It's sort of more of that dynamic driver thump, which I think can still be really satisfying for a lot of electronic tracks. However, because there's less of that mid-bass kind of thump or richness in that region, the vocals sound even more scooped on the Z7 Mark II compared to the Z1R, because suddenly there's even less richness with male vocals. And so you get this sort of thing where that region is distinctly recessed. So you end up with a situation where basically all vocals, whether they're male or female, they tend to be sort of less intimate, they're recessed, a step back in the soundstage compared to the other instruments on the Z7 Mark II. And it tends to do two things. One is that it makes vocals a little less engaging for me, and that's really my biggest problem with this headphone. Is I really love that kind of richness of vocal response you get on a lot of Japanese headphones like Audio-Technicas or Fostex headphones, and you don't quite get that with the Z7 Mark II, and I sort of really miss that. But the other kind of interesting thing that vocal recession does is that it creates an artificially wide sense of space in the headphone, because you have the vocal stepped back and then you have that big bass and the big treble. You get this sort of almost like a hollow sound to it that for whatever reason, I really like the Z7 Mark II when there are no vocals, when I don't notice that there is that lack of intimacy, and instead you get that sense of space and scale that I like on this headphone. But when the vocals come in, you kind of feel like it's like listening to voices at the bottom of a kind of well. You know, it's sort of echoey and hollow. It's a little bit like the Focal Elysia, though I think the Focal Elysia has a bit of a wonkier or sort of honkier upper mid response. So I think the Elysia sounds even more hollow and sort of unnatural, and I prefer the Z7 Mark II over the Elysia, but it doesn't sound natural in the same way that even the Beyerdynamic T5P does to my ears. The other big difference from the Z1R is that the treble is not quite as grainy as it is on the Z1R. So it's not a huge difference, but it's enough to make me find this headphone a lot more relaxing to listen to. I can listen to this for hours and hours, and combined with the comfort, it's a relatively sort of relaxing sound, even if it is a little sort of distant and unengaged at times. Now, I wouldn't say that the Z7 Mark II is better than the Z1R in every way. So one sort of aspect that I do really like about the Z1R, and I think it has something to do with the design of that curved housing, is that you do really have a better kind of control of the resonances or the reflections from inside the ear cup on the Z1R. So with the Z1R, when you listen to that headphone, it doesn't sound like you listen to an open headphone, but at least with the Z1R, when you listen to it, and I've done a fair bit of listening to it now, when you listen to the Z1R, you have a sense of this black background where sort of there's not much echo you can hear from the inside of the ear cup, and supposedly the design was based on the idea of tatami mats in rooms in Japanese houses where the sound is kind of deadened. And I think that works really well on the Z1R. In comparison, on the Z7 Mark II, you can totally hear that it's a closed headphone. You can hear the kind of reflection from this, I think, aluminium ear cup design. It's not quite as sort of distinctive as it is on, say, the Fostex TH610, where you can also really, really distinctly hear the sort of kind of boxed in or closed in sound of the headphone. It's really not a huge deal. To me, it's not a deal breaker compared to the way that it improves on the Z1R in terms of that the more kind of smoother treble response and I would say the more natural kind of bass response. So all in all, the Z7 Mark II is, to me, a really interesting kind of headphone. And again, as I said, there are other headphones that I think sort of sound better to me for the price, even at $799. So I think the Fostex TH610 is more in line with my preferences. I think the Beyerdynamic T5P and even the Audeze LCD2 closed back, even though that headphone is very heavy and I would never really entertain the notion of wearing that for any extended period of time, I think all of those headphones have a more agreeable sound to me than the Z7 Mark II. That said, the Z7 Mark II is really easy, to listen to for long periods of time because of that relaxed sound signature and because it is exceptionally comfortable. And there's really no other headphone that I've found, as far as closed backs go, that is as comfortable. So I was very, very happy to pay that $799 price for this headphone just to have something that I can wear around the house or I can wear sitting down for long periods of time, say on an international flight. So I'm sort of curious as to how the Z7 Mark II will compare to the next sort of portable or transportable full-sized closed-back headphone that can be driven out of a portable device that is coming along, and that headphone is the Audio-Technica AP2000 Ti, though that headphone is basically a 2 kilobuck headphone. So I'm sort of curious how it would compare. But for $799, honestly, I'm perfectly happy. And if you are looking for something that is super comfortable, number one, then this is really worth a second look. Anyway, I'm going to link some tracks in the description of this video where I think the Z7 Mark II does really well, and tracks where I think the Z7 Mark II is not such a great performer, so you can maybe get some ideas from that. Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, happy listening.